Hi, I'm Greg Ippolito, and here we are in the heart of Washington Heights at the United Palace, where I'll be doing a little special Faces That Make Us with the Chief Executive Officer of the United Palace, Mike Fitelson. Hello, Mr. Fitelson.
Mr. Ippolito.
Thank you for being here today. Why don't we just start with, just to warm up the camera here, what's your name, what's your position, and what's your favorite dish?
My name is Mike Fitelson. I'm the CEO of the United Palace. I've been here since 2012. You know, pizza, lasagna, quiche, they're all pretty closely intertwined though.
Great. All right. So you like a pastry or a carb base with some cheese involved?
I love food inside food. Anytime you can give me that opportunity. So like, if there was a lasagna pie, which maybe that's something we should work on, a lasagna pie would probably do it for me.
Yeah, that sounds delicious. You mentioned that you're the CEO here. Here we are in New York. What brought you to New York from California?
I'm originally from California, Oakland, California, born and raised. Spent a couple of years in UC Santa Cruz, which is where my daughter is applying right now. Who knows when this goes live, but that's something interesting little tidbit. But I didn't come here from California. I had moved to Chicago around 96, I think it was, chasing one girl. And I got halfway across the country, that didn't work out, and happened to meet another girl in Chicago. And she was from New York. So we hit it off, things were great. There was a very, very light tug of war, east-west, east-west, east-west. She had a clear career path to be a doctor and had long family ties with Columbia, so it really wasn't much of a tug of war. I fell in line, we came to New York. That was I came in 98, and really didn't have any idea what I was gonna do. And decided that I was gonna be a school teacher for a little while. That ended up not being my cup of tea. And when I was done with that, and this woman who I'd met in Chicago, I had just gotten married to her, and God bless her, and my life changed immeasurably because of this. She said right after we were married, I don't care what you do, just find something that makes you happy. And hopefully you are blessed with such an approach after your nuptials.
Yeah,
right?
Amen. Coming up next year.
And I spent, we had moved to Washington Heights because she was going to go to Columbia. And I fell back on the one true passion I'd ever had from a work standpoint, and that was journalism. I started working for the local newspaper called the Manhattan Times. It was a bilingual weekly. This would have been 2002. And started off as a photographer, one of my passions, and started working on stories. And then within a few months, I was the editor, and just had, this is before Instagram and Facebook and all that fun. I think MySpace had just come out while I was at the paper, right? And loved being able to interact with the community and learn the history of this fascinating community, both going back hundreds of years, but also the up-to-the-minute concerns of what was happening in northern Manhattan. And that kind of opened the door to everything else that has transpired.
So you came to New York with a passion already for journalism when you got involved. Were you involved in a paper like that back home? Yeah.
I had worked, so the passion begins with photography. I went to UC Santa Cruz and became an anthropology major. And the esteemed Professor Richard Randolph took us aside one day and sort of broke out of professor mode and became more, mentor, fatherly figure. And he pointed a bony finger at us as a classroom and said, if you're going to be an anthropologist, you got to learn how to document your work. Go out and take a photography class. Yes, Dr. Randolph. Yes, Dr. Randolph, we will. And I took a photography class with a fellow named John Kersey, who was a surfer in Santa Cruz, but also a great photographer, and absolutely fell in love with photography. Head over heels, black and white photography, film. None of this digital stuff wasn't even something we could imagine. But hours in the darkroom, hours with the printer, And that, when I got out of college, went back to Oakland, California, my local newspaper was the Clarion. I believe it came out twice a week. I think it was Tuesday and Friday. And I started submitting my photographs. And the first photograph they ever ran was from my old elementary school and some kid standing next to his science project that was, yes, a volcano. And that same process, take the photograph, write a caption for it. Editor encouraged me to write longer and longer and longer captions. And then suddenly I was a reporter more than I was a photographer.
That's wonderful. And so you found your artistry through photography originally, and then it came more into the spoken word. How did all of those experiences prepare you for the work you do at the United Palace?
Well, I think that I do a little bit of everything that I've done in the past. And certainly all the photography classes, all of the writing classes, it was a liberal arts education. So, the writing and the putting things together, the decision-making, the analytics. But really, and the older I get, the more I fall back on it, it's really the anthropology. It's almost like everyone needs to take a psychology course just to figure out how other people in our species behave and what makes them tick. It's really the anthropology that I feel like on a day-to-day basis I use in both managing the staff here and interacting with all of our clients and partners and possible opportunities that float through my office, this building, and the computer screen on a daily basis. It's really trying to figure out what we want, what we need, and how to go about getting it with the folks and the resources that we have on hand.
So what's a day like in the CEO of the United Palace? You gave us a little bit of a taste. It's really, I often introduce myself as chief bottle washer because it really is whatever needs to happen that day. And usually every day, which is one of the joys of this job, and really is reminiscent of all of the journalism that I did, is you never know what's going to happen next. Every day is an unwritten story, and you're not necessarily the chief, protagonist in the story. You're trying to figure out how that story is going to be developed, who the players are, what the plot is, what the twist is going to be, and when to get out of it if the story's not going the right way. Sure. And speaking of story, you've told the story of the United Palace many times over the years in your tenure here. I imagine when you first got here, you might not have known all of those things, and you've learned a lot as you've been here. What was your first impression when you came to the United Palace? Well, I think it's like anybody else. Just absolutely gobsmacked that this place can be sitting in the middle, in the heart of Washington Heights, and not enough people know that. You walk through those doors and you, for the first time, and you don't know what's in store for you once you get in. And everybody kind of walks in and immediately does the head tilt because they just can't imagine a place like this ever existed, let alone in the 21st century Washington Heights. Absolutely. And with your photography background and being involved with the paper up here, was that what brought you here? Did you come in originally as a photographer and then found a whole other path? Absolutely. It was the newspaper. And it was a woman named Cindy Espinoza who was working with the then city council member Miguel Martinez. And she had put together a children's event, much like we do now with District 6. But I think that I don't think it was with the school. I think it was actually with nonprofits. And it was kids performing in here. And I walked in that first day having no idea what to expect. And Cindy showed me around, and I said, wow, we've got to do something about this. And it was very much still a fully functioning every Sunday and a couple of times a week church at that point. This would have been probably 2003, 2004. So Reverend Wright hadn't been here in a while, but there was still very much his influence and flavor in everything that the church was doing at that time. And like
anybody else. I just imagined what this place was, what it is, and what it could be.
And at that point, you mentioned Reverend Ike hadn't been here for a little while. He was still alive and sort of managing from a distance. And I imagine he needed some people on the ground to take charge. Is that sort of how you got involved with managing here?
Well, at that point, it would have been 2003, 2004. He passes away in 2008.
Right.
And I was with the newspaper when that happened. And I remember doing the cover story of his passing. Great, fantastic photo of him on stage, with all the splendor around him. And interviewing a bunch of folks who were connected and beginning to learn more about the story there. But you've also got to remember, when I was at the paper, this was just one place in a community that spanned 155th, all the way up to the northern end of the island. There were just a million things going on all the time. But his passing certainly put it higher on the radar. And then in 2011, I resigned my position with the newspaper, just being burned out on journalism. And, we had a small staff and it was a weekly grind and every day was a different deadline. And I just needed to do something else. One of the key elements of the newspaper was that we very much wanted to use it as an organ to bring the community together, a very fractured community across many different lines. Not the least of which is a language divide, English speaking and Spanish speaking. So in doing a newspaper, as much as we could, every story would be in English on one side and Spanish on the other, so people could actually recognize that you're all getting the same information, you're all getting the same story, literally, and we were going to try to build community around that. And this was very much the vision of Luis Miranda, who was one of the 4 founders of the newspaper, and very much the strongest advocate and most active with the Manhattan Times. And we extended that by also very much focusing on the arts, because we figured that is a second language that we could try to use to bring everyone together. If you wrote about an artist or if you put a piece of artwork in the newspaper, that's a language that the artistic language is something everybody could appreciate, from wherever they're coming from. And that grew into starting the Uptown Art Stroll, which started off being a one-day arts festival uptown, very much to highlight the lack of professional visual arts spaces and performing arts spaces uptown. And we would put our artwork in bodegas or doctor's offices or the community board, any place with a vertical surface that they would allow us to hang something on. And then through the newspaper, we'd print a map and list all the artists and all the different art experiences people could have from one end of the neighborhood to the other. That grew over a few years, and then Luis was able to work with the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone in creating the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance. And that's something that I had taken a break from the paper at that point, and I was one of the consultants that helped build that organization, which was very much focused on supporting the artists uptown, because there were a gazillion of them, as being one of the so-called most affordable places to live in Manhattan. A lot of the artists flocked here, but there wasn't the infrastructure for the arts to really flourish. So we had the paper to talk about it, and we had NOMA as a place to advocate for it and support. The one thing that was missing, of course, was the space. Where were you actually going to do all this arts activity? In my journalism, I had done a few things with the United Palace, and there was a fellow named James Stovall who was very involved in the church, and we struck up a rapport, and he was the one who advocated for turning the annex into a gallery. And at some of the early Uptown art strolls, there was exhibits in the annex that were, as I say, part of the stroll that you could stop by and see. And they put the lighting in, we've got those little, beams of light to help highlight it. It was really the first step towards, creating the possibility of this becoming more than a 3,400 seat theater in Washington Heights. So when I finally burned out on the newspaper, which would have been 2011, Noma had found an office space at Our Savior's Atonement and had actually a very beautiful gallery space at that point. But it was a walk up, no elevator to the second floor. And I heard from, I was invited to Juan Bago, Michael Diaz.
Mm-hmm.
He had something called the Bago Brunch. This would have been January 2nd or 3rd of 2012. And it was up here at the old Pick and Eat. And he did this, he got artists together and we would, people would just talk and network and mingle. And I remember walking in, pretty much unemployed at that point. I was doing a little bit of consulting and a little bit of gig work here and there. Walking in on, one of the first days of January, him seeing me and him literally grabbing me by the lapels and dragging me upstairs to the loft area of Pick and Eat and saying, Mike, you have to meet this woman. And it was Mariana Houston. It was Mariana Houston, who she told me had been hired to create an arts organization at the United Palace. I was like, I'd heard this story multiple times over the years with the newspaper. I'm like, yeah, right. How are you the one, you have no connection to Washingtonites. How are you going to be the one who's going to create this organization that we've all dreamed of in the neighborhood? And she said, because Reverend Ike's son Xavier wants me to do it. And that's when I went, okay, I'm going to shut up. She's going to talk, and I'm going to listen to what she says. And we talked for about an hour, and she told me how she'd begun meeting the other organizations. She'd had a couple of meetings here. She had the full backing of Xavier. And I decided that no matter what, paid, unpaid, volunteered, stealthily, whatever, because I'd already gotten that free pass from my wife to do whatever makes me happy, right? I get out a free jail card. Mm-hmm. I said, Mariana, I don't know where this is going to go, but anything you need, I'm here to help. And that was 13 years ago, 14 years ago, next year. I am still here doing whatever it takes to turn this into that art space, arts organization that fills the needs of Northern Manhattan and the rest of the city.
It's wonderful. It's very clear why it was created, and I think we've seen a good, clear trajectory from your days in journalism and with the Manhattan Times to Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance to United Palace of Cultural Arts, that nonprofit. Can you connect the dots for us a little bit under the umbrella of the United Palace, where United Palace of Spiritual Arts, or the original church body, connects into that trajectory with United Palace of Cultural Arts, and then into where you want to go with United Palace for Arts and Culture? Sure
thing, absolutely. And then there's kind of two different ways, that seem separate but are really the same stream. And that goes back to what I was talking about with James Stovall. The church was already doing all of the art stuff. Arts was really one of the vehicles that it was using to reach out to the community and the congregation. They had created a seasonal, let's call it a seasonal gallery over in the annex. The stage, and Xavier talks about this, Reverend Ike's son Xavier talks about this, how even from him growing up in the space, there was always artists on stage, performers on stage. Music was always a part of the Sunday services, whether it was the choir or what Xavier's passion was, West African drumming, was very much happening and not separated from what was happening with the church or what was happening from the message of the day. The arts was one more way of carrying that message, and really the message of, come on in or smile as you pass. The theater, the space was very much open to whoever was going to pass by and walk in. And that was very much the legacy of what Reverend Ike had always envisioned his church and his mission to be, is let's make sure that people feel connected, and let's find whatever media is required to connect people. He started off as kind of a storefront preacher, and he very much was a traveling preacher, going from church to church down south. and he built up his following, and he built up his following through that human connection, making sure that people who needed, were at least met and recognized. And when he got on his way to getting his space, he was on radio, and he was big on the radio. He had a huge following. And then he recognized the possibilities of television. And he was on television, and he had an even huger audience on television. And although he did not have a long time in the internet space, the church was in the internet. The church was trying everything. The church was always trying to find that next media to get the message out. And the arts were certainly one way of doing that. So my parallel to that goes back to the newspaper and how it was all about finding a way to build community in this very disparate, geographic location. And we did it through language, English and Spanish, and we did it through art, trying to find people to rally around a piece of art, performing arts, to really find themselves and each other in the space. The fact that we now have a 3,400 seat theater to do that, just continues that mission for what we were writing, back on the neighborhood rag all those years ago.
Wonderful.
Dots connected? Dots
are connected. And then if we could talk about the new phase with United Palace for Arts and Culture and how things might change slightly. There's a process, an ongoing process with the Attorney General and transfer of assets such as this beautiful place. So what might change in the mission, in the vision, in the overall scope of work to make this 3,400 seat venue available for arts uptown?
We were talking about my days at UC Santa Cruz, a little while ago. And one of the tenets that I walked away with from my years there, and it was a very California thing that I think has also become a very, worldwide thing, is the only constant is change. And I think that that's a good description of where we've been in the space and where we continue to head is, the theater opened in 1930 as a way of bringing people together. And it was very specifically chosen to be in this neighborhood, as were the other four Wonder Theaters, very much in, working class, immigrant neighborhoods, to make sure that there was a beacon or a rallying point in those neighborhoods for a community to grow around. These were folks who were learning how to be American in this great melting pot of New York City. And that was the reason why the United Palace was in Washington Heights and not in, Murray Hill or Tribeca. This was the next great frontier of New York, one of the next great frontiers of New York City to build community in. And at the time, it was very much done through film and a little bit of the performing arts, a little bit of the vaudeville carried over. And when it became a church in '69, it was very much serving that same mission. The difference is that the media of the 30s, 40s, and 50s of film was no longer that rallying point for hundreds or at the beginning, thousands of people. There needed to be a new message. There needed to be a new style of outreach to attract that kind of an audience. And as these big, beautiful theaters were kind of losing that audience, that's when the church, led by Reverend Ike, comes in and says, you know what? We're still going to build community. We're still going to use this space and the energy of the space to build community around. But instead of it being your latest cinematic fantasy, we're going to do it through spiritual endeavors, a spiritual purpose. And I'm going to bring to you my interpretation of the Bible, and I'm going to bring to you my experience as an African American in this country at this time, and my perspective on how the church interacts with our community and how we can use it to build a stronger community among all of us. And the arts was certainly part of that message making and that communication. When the church began to shed its congregation, and when the congregation began to dwindle, in the 2010s and 2020 specifically, the aughts, I guess we're referring to them as the aughts, right? The aughts in the early 2010s, there needed to be a new way of continuing to build community. The people who weren't necessarily interested in, the just following the Bible. And that's where the arts began to find a home here. So we've had this, since the beginning, we've had, I kind of picture it almost like a teeter-totter of, starting off as an all arts film space and then slowly moving into an all spiritual space and kind of reverting back to more of a stasis right now. And that certainly has been the story over the past, 10, 15 years. And I think we're going to continue to follow that trend and see where the arts can take us, both through what we do with our homegrown artists and emerging artists and young people who very much need a stage in Washington Heights, but also bringing more arts activity to the community that wouldn't necessarily ever play Washington Heights, that might stay downtown, that might not ever be something that would be an easy reach for our local residents. Why bring Moses to the mountain if you can bring the mountain to Moses? That's what we're doing here. But with that teeter-totter, and as we're dipping more and more into the arts, we don't ever completely walk away from the spiritual, as we never have. And we're interested in exploring how arts can continue to be a vehicle for touching, that part of your word of choice, spirit, soul, consciousness. How can we continue to use the arts and this space to help people wrestle with those great questions? And what seems to be even more confusing as a Washington Heights resident, as a New Yorker, as an American, as a human being on this planet right now, how do we continue to give people the resources to find to one, ask themselves the questions, and then two, seek the answers for them that will help their lives become more complete. So we are going to continue to explore that from an artistic standpoint without abandoning the spiritual. I believe it's very much, part of the same holistic makeup of a human being, particularly the types of human beings the anthropologist in me wants to engage with. So for me, there's not much of change as more a continuum. We're continuing to explore this continuum, this trajectory that was set in place by the Lowe's Corporation back on February 22nd, 1930.
Amen. So a spiritual community, an artistic community, an inspirational community. An inspirational community. And in that community, there's a lot of support for this work being done and continuing. Earlier this year, there were votes even made in support of continuing this mission, both by our Board of Trustees and by our congregation at a Muse event. What did that represent for you and for the future?
So as we continued to explore both the artistic side and the spiritual side, which in many ways for us is the two sides of the same coin, there are going to be some changes that people are going to, if you're paying very close attention, you're going to see and feel here at the United Palace. One, the overarching organization is going to become the United Palace for Arts and Culture, which I think very much puts the emphasis on what we're looking to do. And again, as the anthropologist in me, culture, yes, we love to be able to hit the culture drum as hard and loud as we can. Thank you, Xavier, for that. And it also, we like the acronym, I think very much represents how we want to be seen and help people understand what we are. The acronym is UPAC, right? Like a performing arts center. And we very much want people to have that relationship with a space where really anything can happen. You know, we've got our big stage in here for performances. We turn the foyer into a smaller, little, glorious jewel box of a theater for 100 people. And we work with the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance on curating a gallery and the studio spaces in our annex space that will also see transformation in the coming years to really make this a beacon and a hub for the creative arts and cultural scene that is always bubbling up, you know, from the Washington Heights community. And you know, since my days with the newspaper and the Stroll, is always looking for more and more ways to express itself and showcase what it has to offer. So I think very much you're going to continue to see more of the same, probably more of it on a bigger scale and a greater diversity of what that more is. And we're very excited that we've just announced our first few shows that we are booking ourselves, that we are bringing to Washington Heights. And I think that it demonstrates beautifully some of the range of experiences we want our local folks to have. And that's going to be the one and only comedian Tracy Morgan performing in February. The following month, March, we'll have Celtic Woman come and perform their blend of Irish music and dance, which, you know, cultural with a capital C. And then in June, we've got Sesame Street Live and Elmo's Got the Moves for our little tykes in the neighborhood. You know, and just picture Tracy Morgan, Elmo, and Celtic Woman as some of the faces that we want you to see when you come to the United Palace. And I think that that is just going to be a wonderful experience to continue to remind people of this. And I always get a little depressed when I hear this phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway. This hidden jewel of Washington Heights that, oh yes, baby is a jewel, but we have no interest in anyone thinking of it as being hidden. This is going to help us get the word out about what's happening at UPAC in Washington Heights.
And to that end, a jewel, whether it be hidden temporarily or once it's on the center stage, you've talked a lot about us being stewards entrusted to protect it and to keep it restored and sparkling and a shiny jewel. And so with that, we should go back for a moment, all the way back to why was this building put in Washington Heights? You talked a little bit about how it was the forefront of neighborhoods and communities being built in New York. But what was really the programming focus back then to what we know? We talked a lot about the transition, but back in 1930, what did this mean to this community?
Certainly. There could be an argument made that the United Palace, what was then the Lowe's 175th Street Theater, was the last great movie palace built in America. It was the fifth of the five so-called wonder theaters. There was the Valencia in Queens and the Paradise in the Bronx and the Kings in Brooklyn and the Jersey over in Jersey City. This was the fifth one to be built. Each one was built as both a temple to cinema, which had just taken the country by storm after the penny arcades and the Nickelodeons. It was really the movie theater and beyond that, the movie palace that had captured America's imagination in the 1920s. And the funny thing about this place is they break ground in January of 1929 with the intention of opening in February of 1930. And midway through, we have the stock market crash. The America that this theater opened in was completely different from the America that it had been constructed in. And nobody really knew what was going to happen. I'm sure that there were a lot of people in the Lowe's Corporation who were terrified that they had just built a white elephant in this neighborhood that nobody really had known what direction it was going to take yet. But of course, the movies were a lifeline for millions of Americans during the Depression. They could spend a quarter and come here and get a full day's entertainment. The opening day, the Lowe's Orchestra performed. There was vaudeville routines. There were little shorts on television, newsreels. This is how a lot of Americans were getting their news, because a lot of folks didn't have radio. Certainly there were no TVs, no telephones. You would go to your local cinema. We happened to seat 3,400 at the time, and that's how you would keep up on the news of the day. And you would meet with your neighbors, your friends. We had a smoking lounge for both the men folk and the women folk, where I'm sure connections were made, deals were done, business was transacted in that sort of informal entertainment space where so much of business actually takes place. Golf courses now, smoking lounges back then. And this really served as the big, monarch movie theater of the neighborhood. There were a dozen others around town, but this is where the big show was. And they got a new movie, a new title every week, so people would come back. It's sort of like episodic television, where you get a new episode every week. Now, you'd get a whole new movie every week, and you would, instead of your living room, you would come here to enjoy it and have all of your friends and family and neighbors surrounding you and digesting whatever content was coming to you that week. And it was beautiful, and it was spectacular, and it lasted for a very long time. And we very much feel that in both the theater's bones and in our bones, that this building was made for cinema and made for movies. And we continue to want people to have that experience. I'm like no one else. Like everybody else, I love to end my day on my couch at home, just flipping through the channels, whatever might capture my fancy. But that's not where I watch a movie for the first time. I want to come to a space like this. I want to come to a space filled with strangers, so I hear them laughing when I'm laughing, and I'm hearing, them freak out when I freak out, and it reminds me how much more connected we are than we might think we are when we're all living in our little silos. And maintaining that experience where we can do a monthly movie, and a title that people may love, and it might have a cult following, but a lot of people are seeing it for the very first time. Being able to introduce more people and more generations to very much the magic of the movies is our stock and trade, to the point where we always have some type of live component to a movie screening, much like they did that very first day when the Lowe's Orchestra was here and Sean Lee Comedy Act was here. We're always looking to doing something to have the movie come alive, because we think that that's the experience that cinema can deliver, and we think that that's the experience that we want our audience to go through, because it's transformative, and it brings you to a different place when you walk out of this theater than where you were when you walked in.
Absolutely. And I do want to talk more about the movie series today, but before we get too far from 1930, maybe there are a couple things you want to share that were, obviously this is a delirious masterpiece, and it's a miracle that it's still here, having opened during the Great Depression, having been rescued by the church in 1969 from potential demolition, and all the other things that the city's gone through since. What were some of the things that made it really unique at the time? Obviously, it's one of the last of its kind to be made with this level of detail, but what were some of the other maybe technical marvels that this place has that maybe people don't know when they visit? You mentioned smoking lounges.
Right. So the United Palace, which opened as the Lowe's 175th Street Theater, the most boring name anyone has ever given a theater of the stature.
Directions more than a name.
It really, yes, it's coordinates. It was a pre-GPS system, so you never lost your theater. The Wonder Theaters were so called not because of their grandeur and their architectural marvel. They were known as Wonder Theaters because they each had a Robert Morton Wonder organ that, in their thinking, would help transport the audience to wherever they needed to go. Originally, the intention was the silent movies are here to stay, and instead of hiring an orchestra to play the music while the movie is playing, we're going to build this contraption so one person can play all the sounds of an orchestra, and we can save money instead of hiring an orchestra. Feel about that however you will, but it really was a miraculous contraption that they built. This organ that could replicate all the sounds of an orchestra and add those very cinematic sound effects like a car horn or horse hoofs, what have you. And that was really the calling card for audiences when they were coming to the theater, is that the show would begin with an organ performance before you even got to the movie, which I think must have been magical to folks who very likely didn't even have a phonograph in their apartment. So that was really the key architectural, that was sort of the key technological advancement of this theater. It did offer what they called air conditioning in its own rudimentary way. We would not recognize it as such in our, pampered 21st century lives. It offered the architectural details of a dreamland where you walk in and you're immediately met by these two elephants that are straddling our staircase, and just waiting to welcome you into the theater. There are cherubs, there are Buddha-looking figures, dragons, phoenixes, and we haven't done it yet. It's been on my list for literally 14 years. We have to come up with a scavenger hunt for kids to come through and find the duck-billed platypus in the architecture of the United Palace. I think that would be so much fun. And I defy anyone out there to find the seahorses. $5 for anyone who can find it. Promise. We also have one of the pieces from lore that we still use is the stage. The stage is entirely on a lift and can go up and down and stop at any point. We sometimes use that when we do a live to projection, and we'll have musicians or an orchestra perform on stage. We'll drop it, and then we can project the movie, the image, whatever it might be, over their heads, so the audience can have that, the inspirational moment of seeing the music created out of thin air to accompany whatever it is they're watching.
So how did the movie series come back? How did that come to be, and how did you come to be one of the main hosts of this series?
So the movies ended at the United Palace in 1969 when the church moved in. And as the story goes, it was April, and it was a screening of 2001: A Space Odyssey on a Friday night in April. And it wasn't even first run. 2001 had been around for a year, and it was coming back for its second or third time because it was such a popular movie, and everybody wanted to see it on a big screen. The story goes that at that Friday night screening, in the audience, which maybe had 30 people in it, were Reverend Ike and his wife, Mrs. C. And they were here to take in the splendor of the theater and bear witness to what at the time everybody expected was going to be the very last screening in this building. Because 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, the church held its first services in this space. And the church continued to serve this space with Sunday services for decades. And movies were kind of forgotten about. The flash forward to, I'm going to get my dates wrong here, flash forward to, I believe it was 2014, and it was the 5-year anniversary of In the Heights debuting on Broadway. And I had known the Miranda family because I was running, previously I had run Luis Miranda's local newspaper called the Manhattan Times. And his son, Lin-Manuel, had, at the time, was splitting his time between, being in school during the school year at Wesleyan and then living in Inwood during the summer. And Luis was very supportive of Lynn's activities in Wesleyan and in pursuing the theater. But when Lynn was back during the summer, Luis, like any good father would, expected Lynn to help out at this job, which was helping write for the newspaper. So Lynn was writing stories about the neighborhood, and I'll never forget, he was the one who reviewed the very first Uptown art stroll that we did, which we then published in the newspaper, come the following Friday. So I had this relationship with the Miranda family since 2002, 2003. And when Luis found out that I got the job here at the United Palace, we were going to begin to do more and more art stuff. Luis having that, spectacular brain of his said, well, of course, the 5-year anniversary of In the Heights is coming up. We should do it here. And again, bring the art to the community instead of the community having to go downtown. So we figured out a way of doing it. It wasn't the full show. It was just the concert version of In the Heights. So we had all the music, and Lynn threw in one song that had been left on the cutting floor. So the audience got to hear, in some ways, what was very much the premiere of a song that didn't make it, a B-side, as it were. And it was great, full house. The audience loved it. Folks from the community got to do something like, this high profile in their own neighborhood, which was mind-blowing to folks who'd lived in Washington Heights their entire life. A couple of days later, I went up, met with Lynn, and said, Lynn, we've got this theater now. We can do things with it. In the Heights was phenomenal. You're a writer, you're a singer, you act, you dance sometimes. What do you want to do with this theater? And he said, let's bring back the movies. Boom, just like that. First, let's bring back the movies. So with his support and the community support, we did a fundraising campaign to purchase a projector and gussy up the space a little bit. And we raised $40,000 in 40 days and asked all of our supporters, what movie do you most want to see as the inaugural movie back at the United Palace? And it was a very, very close vote, but Casablanca beat out Star Wars by just a couple of votes. So it was that, I believe it was November of 2014. We had this gala screening of Casablanca. And we said, anybody who wears a tuxedo can get in free. So people just were dressed to the nines, and the canes, and the hats, and the scarves, and stoles. And we had just this magical screening. And on stage beforehand, there was a local rap artist who had just released a song and video that happened to parody Casablanca. So he came out and did the performance, and we showed the video, and it was that perfect moment of collapsing time where this great piece of art was still having a ripple effect on, at the time, 2014, in a completely different genre, right? Black and white, classic drama, current hip hop. It was fascinating, and the audience loved it. And that really is where we pioneered this. We have to have some live entertainment. The following year, Lin-Manuel helped us, curate and program that first season, and it was all movies that had a strong New York presence. And we did things like Ghostbusters, and doggone it, we had a professional team of Ghostbusters from Jersey come out and bust Slimer before the movie. We had the original screening of King Kong, and the director, John Landis, came out and was Lynn's guest beforehand. And what was very much the capper of what we'd always dreamed of here, we showed West Side Story, and Lynn's guest was Rita Moreno, who had happened to live just a couple of blocks from the theater back in the day. And it felt like this homecoming, this family reunion of folks, and a celebration of Washington Heights. And that spirit, all of the challenges that we've had over the years with mission and direction and funding and COVID, the DNA for what we do was unveiled, discovered, during those first few screenings. And I don't believe we have really strayed much from that dream.
And I really like the idea of people wear a tuxedo, they get in free. I think we should bring that back.
There are people who would do it. There are also people who would wear the tuxedo and pay $10. So
Hey,
let's start with that.
All right, let's invite them to wear the tuxedos, and then we'll make it a discount if no one does it. What has this place taught you personally about yourself, leadership, or community?
So I think the crazy thing about me landing here and me being here for these, 13, 14 years, however long it's been, is that it really has become a dream come true, but I never knew it was my dream. I didn't grow up as that theater guy. I didn't grow up in love with Broadway. I certainly loved the movies and loved music and still do. But the idea of the space, of going to spaces, was never something I thought about. Growing up in Oakland, California, I was blessed to have the Paramount Theater as our hometown theater. And will always be spectacular. I love that theater. And I remember going early on with my cousin Shelley to see a screening of Night of the Living Dead. And they were pioneers in this. They had hired people to dress like zombies, and during the movie, they just walked, they shuffled down the aisles, and every now and then would kind of like lay their hand on your shoulder. It was very much a precursor to what we've always done here. And I love that magic and that creativity and that inspirational spark. But I think the interesting for me is I didn't have that dream of, wanting to be in a theater space or manage a theater space, or have to deal with the leaky roofs. I mean, this is the worst thing in the world for a homeowner, is to own a 100-year-old theater and have to maintain it. Nobody should be cursed with that job, right? But the thing is, what I think I got out of it is just the basic idea of dreaming, of this being there was somebody a long time ago who wrote that theaters are dream worlds for the disenchanted. No. Theaters are dream worlds for the disillusioned. Mm. And I think that I had always had that current in me, recognizing disappointment, recognizing melancholy, recognizing all of the pain and suffering and hardship that goes on in one's life and in this world. And the idea of being somebody who can help create that space that provides an antidote to that when somebody walks in the door. I don't think I would have ever known, and I may not have ever known that was something that I loved and longed for until thinking about that moment right now. But that really is something that drives me every single day. And there's certainly elements of that in running the newspaper, and there's certainly elements of that as a photographer and combing the world for those decisive moments that I can share with somebody else. And God, yes, there was a lot of that in being a classroom teacher. But to find that as the keeper of a dream world, that's a pretty special place to be. And my life would have not been the same or would have been anywhere near as satisfying as it's been had I not blindly stumbled into that opportunity.
And what do you say to the dreamers who want to get involved here? Maybe not even just as donors, but as participants or ambassadors for what we're trying to do here.
It's funny. I was at a fundraiser last night for Scouts, for Scouting America. And the final person who spoke talked about the most important word is perseverance. And I think that there's very much a thread, an undercurrent of perseverance in everything in certainly the theater world, certainly in the art world, where you may never feel as valued as you believe your work should be, no matter who you are or what you do. But it will never happen if you don't persevere. And I don't think I would have come up with that word off the top of my head, except for being at this event last night. But I think that certainly the the challenge of maintaining a nearly 100-year-old theater in a neighborhood that is so far removed from the art capital of America. You don't get this far and you don't make as much progress as we have if perseverance isn't in your bones and blood.
Mm. Beyond the big events, what would you say is the heart of the United Palace?
Well, I would turn that question around. I don't believe the heart of the United Palace is the big events. The heart of the United Palace is giving people the opportunity to walk in and be inspired, whether it's just from walking around on a tour and seeing the architecture and imagining that a place like this was ever built and still exists, to giving either emerging artists or young people the opportunity to perform in a space where the space itself values what they're doing, and give them the opportunity to have an audience also value what they're doing. That is, more important to me on a day-to-day basis than bringing in the next Bad Bunny. That's really, this theater can do a lot to, bring top-name talent to the community and sell lots of tickets and continue to maintain it in the manner to which it needs to be maintained. But if we just did that and we ignored our mission to make this an accessible space for folks to explore their dreams and express themselves in this community, we'd be wasting our time.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Mr. Fitelson.
Mr. Ippolito, it was a pleasure.
And this has been a special Faces That Make Us at the United Palace. Thank you, Mike Fitelson, for your time. We'll see you at the next one.